Jimmy, today obviously I'm on my walking pad, but today I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about consistency. So, consistency has been something you've always told me is one of the most important, if not the most important training aspect, especially for endurance. So, just wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that, and if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your expert knowledge.
Yeah, so I get asked quite a lot about what are the absolute most important things that people that I coach do when they're doing training programs. And when you get into listening to podcasts, listening to experts, reading books, magazines, there are so many different areas of endurance sport performance. And so it can become quite a daunting task to try and separate everything out and think, right, what are the absolute things that I need to do? And I think that the one thing that keeps coming back is, and I've heard multiple top sports scientists and coaches talk about this, and we'll maybe talk about some of those in a minute, but it's the consistency of training. So it's not getting caught up necessarily in how much high intensity you're doing each week, what your power meter is saying, if you've got a foot pod or you ride your bike, how much distribution of training you've got between training zones and all of this sort of stuff. All of that becomes important, particularly if you're doing lots of training. How you distribute your training is vital. But the most important thing of all is that you do consistent training. Okay. And so you have to be going out day after day, week after week, month after month in order to see good, consistent improvement in your performance. If you're somebody who does an amazing training session, but then has lulls in your training where you go a prolonged period of time without doing very much, then you're probably not going to get the same progress, even if you nail that session as somebody who's doing consistently good work over time. If you follow somebody like Steve Magnus online, he posts about this cons- consistently. He consistently posts about consistency. There you go. Where it's not about doing amazing training, it's about doing consistently good training. And if you look at some training theory, how long would a good training program last depending on the event? It's probably going to be about 12 to 20 weeks. So you're looking at a block of time where, above all else, you're trying to be consistent. And I think that's really important. Stephen Seiler, who is one of the world experts in endurance training, he did a lecture called Seiler's Hierarchy of Endurance Needs, and he identifies consistency as the absolute most important thing. So before you start thinking about what your power is, what the intensity of a session is, what your heart rate is, if anybody's ever measured lactate or anything like that, it's about getting out as often as you can. And I heard Stephen Seiler talking recently about the training of some of the winter sports athletes in Norway, and they would be looking, this is at the elite level, so everything gets watered down to normal people like us. So they were talking about, could they complete 500 to 600 training sessions a year? And above all else, it's that consistency of training that helps them reach the pinnacle of their sport. And if you look at elite cyclists, when they're building their aerobic base in the off season, they might be doing 30 hours a week plus on their bike. It's a huge amount of volume of training, but a lot of the top end performance is tied to that. Obviously, if you're doing that sort of volume, that amount of training, you've got to be thinking about how you design each of the training sessions, because a lot of it is going to be at a low intensity if you're going to be able to do that much. But it's the consistency of training above all else. And, you know, if you think about your own training, Nick, over, say, the last 5 years, when you trained for your ultra marathon in Arran, it was, the consistency was unbelievable. And it was that over time that really saw performance going up. And that's something that you must think, looking at times where you've gone and done, like you did the Edinburgh Marathon and you did it off a relatively short training block, I think, and found it a challenge. Whereas when you went and did the Isle of Arran Ultra, which you put so much time and investment into, your training block over a long period of time was fantastic, and consequently your performance was outstanding.
Yeah, definitely noticed a difference. I probably undervalued the consistency before the Edinburgh Marathon, but I do think I was maybe under the weather when I did run that. But yeah, I probably had that. Only the Ultra of Aaron, I was going to do it in 12 weeks and just show people you could just muscle it out. After COVID hit, I ended up training for near enough 2 years for it. So, and then I was like, well, I may as well just keep going. So every week I had 3 to 4 runs every single week. So yeah, the consistency, and I think that paid off in the last 10 kilometers where I was basically able to, well, not sprint, but I had plenty in the tank to get to the end. So
yeah.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into the consistency of the type then. So are you talking consistency in aerobic training or consistency in strength and conditioning or all of the above?
Yeah, so I think maybe we can do a separate chat about all of the different ingredients of training. But I think we have to remember that we're preparing for predominantly aerobic events, whether that's a 5K or whether that's an ultra marathon. They're all predominantly aerobic. And so in order to prepare as best we can for those, then the aerobic training has to take priority. So it's the number of times you're getting out there and running. Strength conditioning, it's not to minimize on the importance of strength work. That can be really important. It can help performance. It can certainly help ward off injuries. But depending on the amount of training time you've got available will help you start to plan your week a little bit. And so there are some people I coach who are preparing for Ironmans who might do 10 to 12 training sessions a week. There are other people that I'm coaching for a half marathon, for example, who can commit to 4 training sessions a week. So how you design those training programs are very different as a result of that. But getting out 4 times a week, doing really good quality training for a block of 12 to 16 weeks for a half marathon is really good, consistent training. So it's all about the context of the person. So if you're just getting back into running and you can commit to running 3 times a week for 10 weeks, you'll see some really good progress from that level of consistency. If somebody that's been training 3 times a week for a prolonged period of time wants to sort of take things to the next step, then there is a direct correlation between performance and the amount of volume that people do. So there's different ways of getting volume. It might be that somebody who runs 3 times a week goes to 5 times a week, or it might be that they just extend the duration of each of those runs, for example. So rather than doing a 40-minute run, they do a 60-minute run as their sort of stop run, and then they find time once a week to take their 60-minute run to 90 minutes. So that would be another way of increasing the volume that they're doing. I heard Renata Canova, he's one of the best marathon coaches in the world. I heard him talking about some of the elite programs, and they're doing 200 to 300 kilometers a week, some of these elite runners. It's absolutely vast. But then if we water that back down, if I use myself as an example, I've done quite a few marathons, and my PB came in Paris in 2016, and that was 2 hours 48 minutes. So I was delighted with that. I have run between 250 and 259, say 11 or 12 times, but I've only broken 250 once, and that was in Paris 2016. And so when I go and look back at those different training programs and look for patterns and what was different about it, the only thing that I could find was I actually ran further. So I ran about 25% further in the 20-week build up to the race than I did in any of the others. And so I did greater volume. I'd done more 20-mile runs plus for that marathon than I had for any of the others. Hadn't done more speed work. I wasn't massively faster in fast sessions, but I had done more volume and had been really consistent. And I think that is probably the only thing I can pick as a difference when I look at the training programs side by side.
Okay, so people that don't know about the aerobic system, for example, let's talk about the specifics. Okay, when is that system being activated, and what does the session look like?
Okay, so you're walking on your walking pad at the moment. It's a way of building consistency and volume. Okay, for
Yeah.
somebody who is training for a big event and trying to find ways to get extra training in, which is brilliant. So you are aerobic, anything from like low level activity, okay, to there are different ways of saying where that point changes in sports science, but let's say something like a 5K is largely aerobic, for example. Now, if you want to put a number on that, if somebody does a heart rate max test and they set accurate training zones, then if that person is well trained, let's say somewhere around 88 to 90% of their heart rate max, that will be roughly the top of their zone 4 in a 5 zone heart rate model. And above that point, they will be getting less aerobic. Below that point, they're going to be vastly aerobic. I think even when you look at something like an 800-meter race, which at the elite level is over very quickly, it's still predominantly an aerobic exercise. So yeah, it's there are different ways of measuring it. The majority of exercise is aerobic.
Okay, so let's break it down even further. A dad in the group wants to maintain consistency. Maybe he doesn't have a race on the horizon yet. Maybe he can train 3 times a week. Tell us exactly what the maybe optimum, or say he's relatively fit, and what those 3 sessions should kind of look like. Obviously, we're generalizing this, and there'll be differences between men and personalization that needs to happen. But let's say what's a maintenance for 3 times a week.
Yeah. So before you start to get into training design, I think one of the important things to realize is that your physiology doesn't adapt every 7 days. Okay, it adapts over longer periods of time than that. So you don't have to panic about getting everything done in a 7 day period. So those 3 sessions might be used differently week on week. Okay. So it may be that this week they do a longer run, a high intensity session, and a midweek shorter low intensity session. It may be that the following week all of those sessions are lower intensity, but they're focusing on making them a little bit longer. So they don't always have to be exactly the same. Um, but I think the one mistake that I've been chatting to a guy that I coached this morning about this, is the one mistake that I see is that people tend to go too hard in their easy sessions. So the absolute stock session should feel like it is pretty easy. Um, you can measure where that is, but let's assume that people haven't done any testing and haven't got a heart rate monitor and things like that and don't know how to use it. Is you should go out and you should be running at an intensity where you feel like you can hold a good conversation. So not far off the way that we are chatting here. Okay.
Okay.
Um, and if you feel like your breathing has noticeably changed and you can't hold a normal conversation, then the intensity of that session has probably just changed the zone that you are in. Okay. So I would be saying that certainly 2 of those sessions should be done at a really low intensity where you feel like you could go on and hold that prolonged conversation. And then one of those sessions you might do a little bit faster to test yourself, and whether that's going to a park run at a weekend and trying to run a hard 5K, for example, or whether that is putting together something that looks more like a structured interval session. But I think that one of the things that I see is lots of people think that the high intensity solves all of their problems, whereas actually there is huge, huge value in the low intensity prolonged session. So if they can find a way of making their longer session a little bit longer, even if it remains easier, that's something that's probably going to have quite a marked effect on performance over, let's say, 10 weeks.
Okay. Cool. So The key action points then are obviously consistency, and if we're running as our specific goal, the first one is establishing aerobic base and keeping that aerobic training consistent. And it doesn't have to be over a 7-day window. You can look at extending that out to 10 days or even 21 days. And the other action point is that largely we're running too fast, so that we probably should back off and have a conversational pace for those easy sessions, and maybe just throw in a nice blowout every now and again, or interval session. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. In sort of training lingo speak, people break training blocks up into macro, meso, and micro cycles. Okay, so your macro cycle is maybe your 10 weeks. Your meso cycle might be a 4-week section of that 10 weeks. And then your micro cycle is the week in front of you. And so what I would encourage people to do is, rather than giving themselves something that's too daunting by saying, right, in order for me to train well, I've got to do all of this for the next 10 weeks, look after the next 7 days. Okay. You don't have to fit everything into 7 days. We've covered that already. But if you look at what's your timetable looking like for the next 7 days, where can I fit my training in? Fantastic. If you train, let's say you try and train 4 times a week normally, and you can only fit 3 in this week, that's not a major problem. It doesn't have to be perfect. But if you do a 10-week block where you've got 4 sessions a week every week, then that's 40 sessions. If you happen to miss a couple of those because you've had a work thing crop up or the kids are unwell, and you end up doing 36 sessions, that's not going to be a massive game changer. But if you can get 36 of your planned 40 sessions done in a 10-week block, then you've done pretty well. If you get more than that done, you find extra time, even better. But I think the way to do that is plan out the week ahead, try and commit to it, and then do the same again at the end of this week. And then before you know it, you've put 2-3 good weeks of training together, and you're starting to build that consistency, that habit, and you should start to see performance improve.